This is Radio Diffusion Francais Paris program with the following bulletin. This morning at 1 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Russian troops crossed the frontier between the Russian zones of occupation in Germany and the British and American zones at several points. There have already been several skirmishes between the opposing forces, though details are as yet lacking. It is also announced from Oslo that Tromsø, Narvik, and Trondheim were bombed during the night by a large number of unidentified planes. Keep tuned in to this station.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. Episode 10. When and If. The year is 1952. After failing to win the Cuban presidential election, Fulgencio Batista leads a military coup and establishes a dictatorship. Backed by the United States through financial loans and weapons, he imprisons, tortures, and murders thousands of critics and protesters, while pocketing money from selling off much of the nation's assets. In Bolivia, the military government of Enrique Peranda Castillo is overthrown by the nationalist revolutionary movement after several days of fighting around La Paz that ends with the surrender of the army. The party embarks on an aggressive campaign of land reform and mine nationalization to alleviate the economic depression. In Egypt, the Free Officers movement, led by Mohammed Ayoub and Gamal Abdel Nasser, lead a revolution that deposes King Farouk and ends the British occupation of Egypt except for the region around the Suez Canal. Farouk is sent into exile, while the new government embarks on a project of agrarian reform and industrialization. When and If was written by Philip Reynolds and first published in the United States by William Sloan Associates. When and If begins with the protagonist at home with his wife performing their daily routine, when it's interrupted by an announcement on the radio that fighting has broken out. There has been increasing tensions between American and Soviet forces and their respective allies in the last several months, which has finally erupted into open hostilities. When the French premier comes on the radio to address the nation, he insists that their fighting is not a war, but only defense. The protagonist decides to head out to buy the latest newspapers and speak with the locals about the situation. He talks with one about his plans to rejoin the RAF, but the other has stashed away money for emergencies and plans to flee overseas. While wandering, the protagonist is shocked to see a crowd in front of the Place de l'Opera singing the Internationale. He learns the Party for the Communists are echoing Soviet claims they are merely trying to secure their zones against incursions, and that the bombings in Norway are a false flag operation. Back at home, his wife Monique comments that most people seem to be resigned to another occupation. He continues with his plans to join the RAF, which involves heading to England. Meanwhile, his wife plans to stay at home and become an ambulance driver. They head into Paris together, where they see people cleaning out the shelves at the market and hear rationing is already instituted for some items. When a few American soldiers drive past, there are some cheers from the crowd, but also some catcalls. On the war front, Soviet tanks are sweeping through West Germany and Iran and are massing on the Turkish border. At sea, both Norwegian and British ships have been sunk. The United States demands the Soviet Union withdraw behind the official demarcation line or will declare war. The Soviets refuse and the fighting accelerates. The next morning, the protagonist heads to the airport and flies to England and onto his base. He hears about the steady Soviet advance and train derailings on the Allied side that were the result of sabotage.
At the hotel, I claimed the small room that the billeting officer had procured for me and asked about the measures being taken for civil defense. I was told that strict and detailed instructions had been given out over the radio and the newspapers and were posted in every hotel and public place. These instructions included, among other things, the precautions to be taken against the atomic bomb. In addition, the radio had announced that a general plan for the evacuation and dispersal of all non-essential sections of the community, beginning with the children, would be published the next day.
The Soviet military has expanded operations to Denmark, and submarines in the Atlantic and North Sea have torpedoed several ships. The protagonist is informed he will be stationed in Brussels as a left-behind agent to gather intelligence and engage in limited espionage activities. He is paired with an agent named Lucas, and after being given their equipment, they are flown to the Brussels airport. There they meet Felix, a bookkeeper and house owner who is part of their network and who provides them with a room. The next morning, the protagonist and Lucas obtain local clothes, and then head to a nearby factory where they get jobs as truck drivers. While out doing deliveries, the protagonist learns the Soviets are advancing through Iran and Iraq towards the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, the British are evacuating Denmark, and Copenhagen has been declared an open city. The next morning, he is woken by explosions and discovers that the Soviets have bombed Antwerp. At the factory, he and Felix use forged Communist Party cards, which help them get accepted into the underground cell, despite only being there a day. They are directed to head to a house where a communist meeting is scheduled to take place. One of the speakers gives a highly detailed briefing of the current military strategic situation. Communist cells in Italy have sabotaged railways and factories, while the cells in France have taken control of Marseille and Valenciennes. The speaker also tells his audience that it's their job to perform similar activities around Brussels to damage the Allies and assist the Soviets when the time comes.
In France, Marseille and Valenciennes were in the hands of the local communists, but mobilization continued in the rest of the country. In certain small towns and villages in France, some citizens, whom the speaker called fascists, had formed a militia. French communist sharpshooters were defying this militia at the risk of capture and summary execution, although some former party members had, quote, shown their cowardice and treachery by abandoning their position at the hour of action, unquote. These traitors, the orator added, would be the first to be punished when their fighting comrades were in power.
The protagonist and Lucas return to Felix and give him a rundown of events before deciding they should move to a working-class district of the city so as to better blend in. They head to a specially marked location where they meet others in the communist cell and a lieutenant in the Soviet army. They are given a mission to drive an oil truck toward the front lines and use the trip to survey details of Allied troops in armor positions. Their drive is made difficult by the mass of refugees trying to escape the fighting, but they slowly head out and join a convoy of other supply vehicles. Suddenly, they are attacked by Soviet planes who are eventually driven off by Allied fighters, but not before their truck, along with several others, are destroyed. They manage to return to Brussels and meet with a Soviet lieutenant who appreciates their work, and they are given special armbands to wear that identify them as cell members for when the Soviets captured the city. They are then issued weapons and told to head to an intersection in the city to assist the entry of the Soviet army. This includes attacking any Allied forces. They reach the position and take command of a handful of other cell members. They watch several fights between Allied and Soviet units, with the latter easily prevailing. However, when the members go to greet the Soviets, they are initially treated with suspicion. When the protagonist produces the papers he was given by the army officer, he and Lucas are promptly driven to a newly established headquarters in the Place des Bienfaiteurs. They are met by one of the party leaders, who informs them the Soviets plan to use the members as a replacement security force since they do not trust the police. The new police headquarters is set up in the Hotel Central in downtown Brussels, where they are given new uniforms and a speech before being sent out.
We waited a few minutes, impressed by the solemnity of the occasion. Then Muriels entered again, accompanied by the new prefect. It proved to be our old friend Van de Wald, who obviously enjoyed our surprise. He addressed us with his customary pomposity. We had an important task to accomplish. We must help our liberators in their work by relieving them of the duty of maintaining public order, and by tracking down fascists and reactionaries who would be treated without mercy. And we, above all, must unmask any spies in the pay of the enemy.
The protagonist and Lucas eventually make it back to Felix, whom they debrief on what happened. He informs them, based on listening to radio broadcasts, that the Soviet military is still advancing across Europe. Over the next few days, the protagonist and Lucas are separately sent out to arrest anyone committing a crime or criticizing the authorities. The Soviet military openly loots the country while the party, due to incompetence, fails to provide adequate food for rations. It's also noted that officers of the MVD, MGB, and SMERSH are installed in the city. The mention of SMERSH is odd, as the organization was decommissioned in 1946 and reabsorbed into the MGB. The protagonist and Lucas begin to set up their own network and recruit an assortment of local people. While the protagonist and Lucas continue their undercover work, they learn of the capture of a person who is referred to as Person X. When they relay this information to London, they are ordered to attempt a rescue of Person X. The protagonist and Lucas effect the rescue by asking fellow officers about the location of Person X, driving there, incapacitating the guards, and freeing him. They then drive to an open field where a prearranged jet lands and they climb aboard for a trip back to London. Their identities in Brussels now burned, they are given another stay-behind assignment, this time in Paris. The protagonist is installed in Paris, where his contact is a man called Lemon, who, along with his wife, provides intelligence in a base of operations. The next day, he heads to Allied Supreme Headquarters, where he is told to liaise with the French Duchemi Bureau and DST regarding agents. He returns to Lemon and meets a group of people who have already been recruited out of various industries. The next morning, he learns from the newspapers of the Soviets' continued advance and of their oppressive measures in Belgium. As Allied forces stage a retreat to the Channel, Soviet jets fly low over Paris, dropping pamphlets encouraging people to rise up and embrace a communist future.
During the day, machine gun installations surrounded by sandbags began to appear at important street intersections. At others, armored cars and even light tanks could be seen, and these were also to be found near all public buildings and banks. For the first time since the outbreak of hostilities, the people of Paris realized that the war had come to their doorsteps. The exodus began with renewed vigor. This time, however, the General Staff had a firm control over the organization of motor traffic.
The protagonist discusses the situation with his group when they are suddenly and unexpectedly arrested, the police having been tipped off by a suspicious neighbor. They are hauled off to the police station and interrogated until the protagonist is able to place a call to Allied headquarters, which convinces the chief of police to release them. Before the Soviet military arrives, the jets return, dropping arms and supplies throughout the city to be picked up by Fifth Column forces. The Fifth Column establish barricades and position themselves at key points to attack and harass Allied columns and the security services, although when they do engage in combat they are swiftly annihilated. Next morning, the general in command of Paris announces on the radio that nearly all Fifth Column forces had been defeated, and notes most of the rebels were foreigners. However, the Soviet military is still on schedule to enter Paris, and the city is declared open to avoid more fighting, with workers asked to evacuate south along with the factories. The protagonist goes into the city to see what is happening, and witnesses some people already celebrating the arrival of the Soviets.
As we began to move, we heard the frightening sound of caterpillar treads. It was a squadron of Soviet light tanks going down the boulevard towards Calais, with soldiers perched on their sides. Some of the soldiers made what were intended to be friendly gestures, doubtless hoping we would reciprocate. Perhaps in the days when Soviet Russia had needed allies and made a show of treating them as such, these Russians had seen newsreels showing the hysterical joy of the population at the Allied troops into Algiers, Paris, and Brussels at the end of the last war, and perhaps the political commissars had let these liberators think that they could expect the same reception.
The Soviets place the communists in charge of the city and institute a ration cart system. They then stage a triumphal march that ends with everyone drunk and what the author says is an indescribable orgy. Similar to Brussels, the occupation leaders are incompetent and venal, and soon there is a lack of food, critics are imprisoned, and even jazz is banned. The Soviets continue to advance on other fronts, with the Allies making stands in Corsica and Spain and slowing them down in Iraq, while the invasion of Turkey turns into a disaster. Switzerland is occupied and transformed into a giant hospital for wounded Soviet troops, with Germans brought in to administer the country. The protagonist continues to expand the network of informers using a cell system, gathering everything from train movements to radio frequencies to industrial production to news regarding nuclear fission developments. However, on the way to a cell meeting, he notices something amiss and asks a child to knock on the door and see who answers. When the child describes someone different from Le Mans, the protagonist asks him to hang a white shirt, a prearranged signal, from the balcony to warn away the other members. Despite this, 8 members are captured, and only 2 survive the war. The protagonist learns that they were betrayed by a recent recruit who had once been part of Joseph Darnan's milice. This was a real fascist organization created by the Vichy government to capture, torture, and often kill suspected members of the French resistance and Jews. Meanwhile, the Chinese government, which has been armed by the Soviets, begins invading other countries. The Chinese army occupies Singapore, Rangoon, and Saigon, but encounters difficulty reaching Indonesia due to the Allied Navy. In order to counter the threat from China, the United States begins to rearm Japan. In Europe, the public mood towards the occupiers sours as living conditions deteriorate, and the authorities expand their arrests and establish prison camps. Discontent boils over during another Soviet-organized triumphal march, with first insults and then rocks thrown at the soldiers, which quickly descends into a massacre, after which the occupation authorities clamp down even harder. In order to prevent unrest among the Catholic populations in Italy and France, the Soviets choose to install a new pope. Meanwhile, the war reaches a new stage when the Soviets hit London with multiple nuclear missiles, devastating the capital.
Several projectiles, believed to be rockets, fell on London. These projectiles contained atomic charges. The number of casualties is not known. No one can yet approach the ruins of what was one of the noblest cities. All our plans had already been made and have been put into effect. I must ask you for your calmness and courage. All the inhabitants of the London suburbs must move immediately and rapidly as possible at least 30 miles from the capital. Only the police and the army will stay where they are to ensure the safety of private property.
The British government orders an evacuation of all major population centers and broadcasts aid techniques for treating victims. The Soviets hit Liverpool with 2 missiles, and then New York and Boston are both struck using long-range bombers. The United States retaliates with a mixture of nuclear and hydrogen bombs on Leningrad, Kyiv, Kharkov, and Stalingrad, among other cities. Meanwhile, the protagonist receives an urgent assignment to locate the hidden bases that are firing the missiles at London. After sifting through information, he discovers a forbidden zone, and has an informant destroy telephone lines in the area so that he, disguised as a technician, can be sent in there to fix them. The protagonist and a helper called Mouse are driven out to make repairs under close guard. In order to escape, they deliberately crash the truck off a bridge into the river and swim away before the guards can discover the ruse. They manage to sneak into the Forbidden Zone and observe a complicated lift system that brings out rockets from an underground base for firing at England. Once back in Paris, they communicate their findings to the Allies, who obliterate the launch site with 3 nuclear bombs. Soon after, the United States announces that it has fired dozens of missiles into the Soviet Union, each capable of vaporizing everything in 50 miles, and says this will continue until the Soviets halt. This forces the Soviets to agree to end the use of nuclear weapons, but the war continues. The protagonist is ordered to head to Spain, where he is given new instructions for helping the coming Allied invasion of France, and has a short visit with his wife, who happens to be stationed there. He is parachuted back into France via Savans, and from there heads to Paris. Soon other agents are parachuted in, with only 2 being captured. The Allied offensive succeeds, with the demoralized Soviet army falling back, its soldiers unhappy about being so far away from home, and firing squads in increasing use.
As dawn approached, we heard a distant hum, which gradually grew louder. A few minutes later, the planes were overhead, and the sky was full of parachutes dropping slowly to the ground. Meanwhile, fighter planes were attacking anti-aircraft batteries in a deafening roar. A few yards from us on the lawns of La Mouette, we could see the dark figures of parachutists hitting the ground, rolling with the agility of rabbits, leaping to their feet, running around their still inflated parachutes to bring them to the ground, and with a single motion detaching their harnesses.
As the Allies approach Paris, the protagonist is ordered to set his cells into action to prevent the Soviet forces from destroying important installations. The liberation of Paris is mostly peaceful, with only a few small battles with die-hard resistors, though afterwards many Soviet soldiers and security officials are murdered and hung about the city. As the Soviet army falls back, there are uprisings in every occupied country, which accelerates their retreat and eventual collapse. This includes Poland and other Eastern European countries that throw off Soviet control. The Soviet Union begins to show signs of disintegrating, while in Asia the fighting between China and Japan reaches a stalemate. In the epilogue, the protagonist mentions he and Monique have had a son, whom they have decided to call Max. When and If is arguably the first European novel about nuclear war to be translated and published in English. It's also one of the few. Although Europe was considered the most likely flashpoint during the Cold War, it produced surprisingly little fiction on the subject. There are several possibilities that might account for this scarcity. Certainly most Europeans were busy rebuilding after the devastation of the Second World War, and rarely had the time or inclination to envision another catastrophically destructive conflict. When they did turn their attention to the matter, it was predominantly through nonfiction and philosophical texts, particularly in Germany and France. Europeans also devoted more time, energy, and resources into voting and holding demonstrations against nuclear proliferation, rather than cultural production. Another factor was that unlike Americans, for whom a nuclear war in Europe was an abstraction, Europeans had directly suffered through a conflict and were acutely aware of what another might entail. Many anti-nuclear posters deliberately superimposed nuclear clouds over photographs of devastated landscapes of the Second World War, vividly connecting possible devastation to the real. Another reason was that most Europeans viewed communism as merely another political ideology, and not an existential threat as it became in the American imagination. There were some, however, who considered communism an acute peril that they believed came from both without and within. In this respect, When and If shares themes with the genre of invasion literature, first popularized by the Battle of Dorking, Reminiscences of a Volunteer by George Tompkins Chesney. Other notable entries include The War in the Air by H.G. Wells and The Red Napoleon by Floyd Gibbons. Books of this genre were stridently nationalist and frequently coupled with xenophobia, especially when it involved the Russians, who were portrayed as a filthy, brutish people with ape-like features. Some of this fear-mongering arose after the Great War, but a significant amount of the imagery was copied almost verbatim from propaganda produced by the Third Reich. Europeans had been stunned by the progress of the Soviet military as it pushed back the Nazis, especially in contrast to the dismal performance of their own armies, and some feared Stalin might make a push to annex the rest of the continent. This fear was not unfounded, considering the violence the Soviet Union had inflicted on Poland during its invasion and partition in 1939. There were already tense encounters between Soviet and Allied forces in occupied Berlin, plus friction between Italy and the People's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, such as the shooting down of an American C-47 by Yugoslav aircraft when it breached their airspace. Military planners in the West began creating strategies to counter a theoretical Soviet invasion, and soon a consensus emerged that the superior number of Soviet ground troops and armor would quickly overwhelm any defensive measures. This led to the adoption of nuclear weapons as the linchpin of all defense strategies. In 1950, the United States had almost 300 nuclear weapons, but these had limitations. All the bombs were based on the Fat Man design and required over 40 personnel a minimum of 2 days to assemble. Even then, the bombs took over an hour to prime, activate, and load, making them useless for rapid reaction. Furthermore, the weight of the bomb made the only platform capable of carrying it, the B-29, slow, cumbersome, and highly vulnerable to Soviet aircraft such as the MiG-15. As such, the bomber required a large combat box to allow any measure of survivability, which meant they could only be used in strategic formations, which limited them to targets like cities. For their part, the Soviets initially had no plans to use nuclear weapons in a European war. Stalin had forbidden their use, and the Warsaw Pact nations maintained strictly defensive positions designed to counter a possible American-led invasion. It was only during Khrushchev's time as General Secretary that nuclear weapons began to be integrated into strategic planning. One thing that was shared by both Western and Eastern European politicians was aversion to any proposed use of nuclear weapons. The destruction of the Second World War had reduced much of the continent to ruin, and the thought of enduring destruction several magnitudes higher had many believing that surrender was better than the Pyrrhic victory of a radioactive wasteland. The public usually was not privy to these high-level discussions, but most believed nuclear weapons would be used against cities and other highly populated areas. Everyone dreaded the thought of a war, and tensions between the superpowers dominated the news. When and If provides no details about why the war breaks out beyond vague comments that the Soviets wish to conquer the world. There is also little information on the strategic or tactical rationale behind their use of nuclear weapons. The Soviet delivery systems include bombers, submarines, and short-range missiles, while the Americans and British have long-range missiles. The nuclear weapons are described as capable of destroying everything in a radius of 50 miles, a power that would require a 150 megaton device, something thankfully never developed. When and If is unusual for a novel of the genre, as it spends almost no time describing the destruction caused by nuclear or conventional weapons. Stories in the genre normally devote a significant number of pages detailing the devastation caused by nuclear weapons with an eye towards shocking the reader. While the reason for this omission is unknown, it suggests the author had no interest in describing the destruction and misery a war would have caused. Instead, the main focus of the novel is communism, which is treated as a more dangerous threat than anything else. This preoccupation came to dominate many stories from the early 50s and especially the 60s as the Cold War became an ideological struggle. While the more fanatical responses would come from America, there was no lack of equally fixated writers in Europe, especially in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Spain, and France. France is a unique case that requires a significant detour to explain. The fixation on communism dates all the way back to the Dreyfus Affair in 1894, which pitted the conservative, royalist, and Catholic right against the progressive Democratic left over a Jewish military officer falsely accused of treason. Although Dreyfus was exonerated in 1906 after a bitter legal process, the right refused to accept this, and it opened up a chasm in French politics. This chasm widened during the financial crisis of the 1930s as the worsening situation drove workers to strike. Business leaders invariably blamed communist agitators for the strikes rather than admit to the long, grueling hours and poor wages. Many business leaders also own newspapers, and they used these to accuse the communist parties of sabotaging the war effort when strikes occurred at armament factories in 1938, even though the strikes broke out spontaneously across the entire industrial sector due to dangerous conditions and inflation. They also claimed the socialist and communist parties voted against increased military spending, something that was true but requires context as the military was frequently used to break up strikes and attack workers. Even as the geopolitical situation grew worse and Hitler embarked on his military campaigns, the Reich continued to press Prime Minister Paul Renard to attack the Soviet Union instead of Germany. After the defeat of France and the installation of the Vichy government, businesses, churches, and right-wing politicians took advantage of the emergency measures to identify, arrest, imprison, and often execute members of socialist and communist parties. There was also the mass deportation of 75,000 Jews to the Third Reich, where they were murdered. In the eyes of the right, not all communists were Jews, but all Jews were communists. After the war, few of these people would face trial. Although there were sporadic executions and retribution, so many in France had collaborated at some level that there was little desire for justice. Worse, those in power were often able to use their position to block investigation or judicial inquiries. As such, right-wing politicians often remained in power. They faced a communist party, the PCF, which had resisted the Nazis during the occupation and elicited a quarter of all votes, more than any other party. Things would come to a head in 1947 as economic conditions worsened again. Inflation had gone over 60%, and rationing was still in effect even for food. When the Ramadier government reduced the bread ration from 250 to 200 grams, strikes exploded across France as more than 3 million walked off the job. The situation calmed when the government passed a 3-franc increase, but then fell apart again when business leaders began firing union leaders in a wave of retaliations. The strike grew to include factory workers, miners, dock workers, teachers, and almost all public service workers. The strikes eventually failed due to divisions between the workers and labor leaders. There were also attacks and assassinations carried out by the Guarani Mafia, which was receiving funding from the United States Central Intelligence Agency. At the same time, a rumor was spread in some newspapers that the communists were planning a coup. The United States also threatened to withhold aid, which included the Marshall Plan, unless Ramadier expelled the PCF, which he dutifully orchestrated that same year. Until the end of the Cold War, the right would continue to harass and pursue communist organizations and labor unions, convinced that they were secretly a fifth column. It's a belief palpable throughout When and If, such as when it pointedly describes students, foreigners, and especially workers as being either dupes or enthusiastic collaborators with the Soviet invaders. There is also a telling quote that suggests the author's political leanings halfway through the novel. Quote, "The Russians had given strict orders that every effort was to be made to win the goodwill of the Germans in the Western Zone, just as the Germans for some time after the occupation in France in 1940 had treated the French with every consideration." Unquote. This notably admits the imprisonment and execution of French dissidents. It ignores the hated service du travail obligatoire, which saw the deportation of almost 700,000 French workers to Germany for forced labor. The Third Reich also requisitioned almost 80% of food production. In response, the French government created a rationing system where the official caloric intake was set at 1,300, which is starvation. Those in the countryside kept small gardens, while those in the cities had to rely on the black market to survive. The novel takes pains to condemn a fictional Soviet occupation while downplaying the real actions of the Third Reich. There is another telling quote later in the novel when it describes, "A new danger of frightening proportions was arising in North Africa, where communist agitation, quiescent for a number of years, was growing in intensity." Unquote. Here, the author blames rebellion in the occupied colonies on communism rather than stemming from emerging nationalist politics and the real grievances of the native population towards French occupation violence. Here, the author blames rebellion in the colonies on communism, rather than stemming from emerging nationalist politics and the real grievances of the native populations towards French occupation violence. This obsession with seeing communism not just behind any internal strife, but especially behind anti-colonial movements, widely shared among the right which controlled the government, nearly had horrific consequences. In 1950, France was struggling in its fight against the Viet Minh, which was demanding independence for Vietnam. France convinced officials in the United States that they were fighting a communist movement controlled by China and the Soviet Union, rather than a national rebellion. The United States sent the French occupation forces millions in weapons, vehicles, and supplies. This failed to stem French losses, and when their troops became trapped at Bien Diem Phu, the American government offered to assist with a strategic airstrike which would have included nuclear weapons. President Eisenhower approved the plan on condition that it was part of a combined British and American alliance and was voted on by Congress. It was only Britain's unwillingness to commit to another war that stopped a plan that would have seen another mushroom cloud rise into the sky above Asia. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.